Well, if you have just tuned in, we welcome you to News and Views on Salam Media on this Friday morning. We start off by taking a look at Zimbabwe and the Zimbabwean government talking about committing compensating farmers whose lands were seized during the Robert Mugabe era. We're talking about farmers who lost their land, and we're talking about close on to 4,000 farmers, talking about compensation both locally and for those foreign white farmers. We're joined now by Rutendo Matinyarare, who is a renowned Zimbabwean anti-sanctions activist. Rutendo, good morning to you and welcome to the show.
Good morning, Minette.
Yes, what do you make, of this about turn on the part of the Zimbabwean government after Robert Mugabe, and we knew that some call it a controversial land reform program. Now we are talking of 3.5 billion payout, which is obviously a major economic undertaking for a country like Zimbabwe to farmers who lost their land.
I think the fact is that to say farmers lost their land is also not correct. There was sequestration of land that was lost during colonialism, and that land was not lost to those farmers. It was stolen land. Those farmers should not have had the land. We've also heard of other people that say, but we bought the land, and others saying that we had bilateral investment protection agreements. But we say, how can you have bilateral protection agreements on land that was stolen? Because if you were to buy a stolen car right now, and then you were to say that you've got title over that car when the owner comes to get it, that would never be acceptable in common law. It would never be acceptable in common legal practice internationally for making developments on land that was stolen in the first place. Because remember, Inyet, that this land was never returned to its rightful owners, even when the Zimbabwean government took over Zimbabwe. They continued the colonial system of a government holding land that was stolen from the natives. So the natives were never compensated, they were never returned their land, and there was never reparations for the crime against humanity. So we do not understand the logic. However, we also have to understand that the Zimbabwean government was put under pressure to make this decision because the constitution that Zimbabweans voted for in 2013 actually entailed compensating white farmers. And this was a constitution developed by the United Nations Development Program. There was a lot of sponsorship from the Europeans who sponsored what was called COPAC, or the new parliament that made the constitution. And there was also a lot of influence of white South Africans and South Africans within the development of the new constitution of Zimbabwe in 2013. And that constitution was actually made under the duress of sanctions. So there was a hope that we remove sanctions if we had a constitution that makes the West happy. And making the West happy is maintaining colonial property rights. Yet in 2000, we actually had ZANU-PF trying to create a constitution that would have forced the British to compensate white farmers and for land to be taken back. But we had the opposition of Zimbabwe being sponsored by the Westminster Democratic Fund and other Western institutions to tell Zimbabweans not to vote for a constitutional change because they said it would give Mugabe a lot of powers. But the truth of the matter is they wanted the constitution not to be changed because they didn't want this new constitution that would allow taking of land and compensation by the colonizer to be put into effect. And so Zimbabweans are sitting with a payment of 3.5 billion because of the kind of constitution that they chose in 2013, albeit that constitution was created under the duress of sanctions and heavy influence of our former colonizers and the South Africans.
Well, Rutendo, this obviously begs a question that is this the responsibility on the part of the Zimbabwean government to compensate these farmers, considering the colonial past and particularly looking at and trying to understand why would the Zimbabwean government take this responsibility to compensate these farmers?
So, like I said, there was a lot of duress. Part and parcel, the major reason why sanctions were imposed on Zimbabwe was because of land reform. And it was also because we went into Congo and stopped the Rwandan government and the Ugandan government from overthrowing the Congolese president for Congo to be divided into 5 separate, small, little fragmented states that would have been easier to loot for the West. Zimbabwe was punished for that, but it was also punished for taking land. And that taking of land came up with sanctions that were to pressure the Zimbabwean people to reverse land reform or to overthrow the ZANU-PF government so that a new government could come in and reverse land reform. So when that didn't happen, this is when you saw sanctions being tightened, sanctions being made worse in a hope of removing the Zimbabwean government. But in the event that the Zimbabwean government would not be removed, then it was to force the Zimbabwean government into a GNU, as we saw in 2008. And that GNU comprised of a majority of the opposition and the ruling party. And it is the existence of the opposition in that particular government of national unity that had those members of parliament from the opposition carry out the mandates that they'd been given by the West to force for certain changes to the constitution that especially hinged around land and ensuring that there's going to be compensation for white farmers. They also put in a clause in the constitution to make it very difficult to reverse that land clause. And so the current president, unfortunately, is forced to implement the constitution of Zimbabwe, which did promise to compensate white farmers. And that government is compelled to do that because they need to ensure that they please the West to remove sanctions. And as you know, sanctions, executive order sanctions have been removed on Zimbabwe. New sanctions were put on 11 individuals, but then sanctions that were on the nation were removed. And now the Zimbabwean government is being compelled to actually compensate white farmers if they want to fix their relationship with the West and get investment, get loans from the West. And that is what is compelling that government right now. So I would say it is an agreement under duress. It is also an agreement by the Zimbabwean people themselves in the constitution that they chose. But that is because the Zimbabwean people were not adequately informed in 2013, as they were not adequately informed in 2000 as well, that the constitutional change was an important marker for our sovereignty and for us to get our land back.
An agreement under duress, Rutendo, does Zimbabwe have the $3.5 billion to pay out these farmers?
The Zimbabwean government does not have $3.5 billion to pay out these farmers. And remember, part and parcel of why Zimbabwe is highly indebted is that when we got independence, Zimbabwe had to inherit $700 million of debt from the Rhodesian government or the former colonizer. And when we inherited that $700 million of debt, which is about $3 billion in today's
I think we seem to have lost Rutendo, and we're going to try and get hold of him very, very quickly to try and reconnect. But what we will do is let us go for a quick ad break, and let's try and get him back immediately after this ad break.
Joining hands, Salam Media. Humanity sets the agenda.
Yasin Badat Financial Advisory. Are your financial goals feeling out of reach? Yasin Badat Financial Advisory is here to turn your aspirations into achievements. Our dedicated team, armed with a history of success, is ready to guide you through the complex nature of financial and investment planning. Whether you're a seasoned investor or new to the game, our personalized solutions cater to your unique goals and risk appetite. Trust in our commitment to transparency, integrity, and excellence. Ready to unlock a world of financial freedom? Partner with us today. Call Yasin Badat Financial Advisory at +27 33346 2071 or visit www.yasinbadat.com. Yasin Badat Financial Advisory, guiding you to financial success.
Send food and send kindness to those who have lost their homes and have been plunged into poverty. For those who are a meal away from starvation, a food parcel means an entire family can eat this Ramadan. That's the power of food. Donate now to Islamic Relief.
When the perfect blend of stylish decor, exquisite halal cuisine, and warm hospitality come together, it could only mean Albeit Lodge, your true home away from home. Albeit is the ideal heaven for families, business people, and tourists with its 4-star family rooms and other luxurious facilities, conveniently situated close to Port Elizabeth Airport, the beach, and other amenities. Your stay will be truly unforgettable, as you'll be taking home lasting memories of the warm hospitality, the serenity and tranquility that Albeit has to offer. For reservations, call 041 583 6415 or visit www.albaitlodge.co.za.
For the first time, I can dream again.
The Africa Muslims Agency Orphan Hope Program provides the food, clothing, and basic support needed by thousands of children across the world. Every child deserves a chance at a hopeful future.
For 15,000 trans, you can transform our lives with the AMA Orphan Hope Program.
Africa Muslims Agency, empowering, educating, inspiring.
Breaking stereotypes, moving boundaries, joining hands. Salam Media. Humanity sets the agenda.
Well, we continue our discussion this morning, taking a look at Zimbabwe and the compensation of farmers where the Zimbabwe government is talking about compensating them to the tune of 3.5 billion. As we continue with our guest this morning, Rutendo Matinyarare. Rutendo, we were talking, and just before the break, I know we lost a bit of contact, and we were talking about Zimbabwe, whether the 3.5 billion, and obviously you mentioned they don't have that type of money, but also taking a look at what options does the Zimbabwean government have now that they've made this commitment and they don't have the money.
So let me recap so that we carry through logically from where I left off. So the Zimbabwean government does not have this money. Remember, the Zimbabwean government failed to pay its debts and right now is looking for debt restructuring. They're talking to one of the Rothschild former lawyer to help them to restructure the debt that they stopped paying in 2000. And so for about 23 years, we've been unable to pay our debts. That's why we've been suspended from a number of multilateral lending institutions. And the position we find ourselves in is the position that got us into this debt that we couldn't repay in the first place, in that when we got independence, we were asked to take over colonial debt, $700 million then, which is $3 billion in today's terms. And we failed to pay those debts, that we had to go into something called a structural adjustment program. In that structural adjustment program, we had to get loans to pay previous loans and get loans to pay the loans that were taken to pay the previous loans, and so forth and so on. This got Zimbabwe highly indebted by the time we got to 2000 and did our land reform. And so part and parcel of what was used to punish us, part and parcel of what was used to sanction Zimbabwe was the deprivation of loans because we couldn't pay previous loans. Now we're putting ourselves in exactly the same position, that we are accepting terms to take on debt that we cannot repay, that might take another 20, 30, 40 years for us to repay, as we did with the Rhodesian debt. And remember, when we took the Rhodesian debt after independence, we took it because we wanted to re-engage with the Western world. They were saying that there are UN sanctions on Rhodesia. Those UN sanctions will not automatically be removed. They require us as Western nations to vote for their removal. And if you do not reconcile with your former colonizers, if you do not accept their colonial debts, we will not re-engage with you. And so remember, right now we're at a situation where sanctions were removed. Zimbabwe wants cancellation of previous debts that they couldn't pay. And they're being told again that if you want to re-engage with the West, if you want to get loans from the West, if you want the West to trade with you, you have got to pay these white farmers. The sanctions have been removed, but if you want to get trade and preferential trade agreements and loans, you've got to pay again another colonial debt, which is the compensation of white farmers for land that was stolen, even though those white farmers never paid reparations, and even though some of the people who bought that land bought it while it was still stolen land. And just to close off on that, what are we going to do now? Well, I would assume that one of the only options they've got is to take more loans. And this puts us in exactly the proverbial debt slavery that the IMF and Western countries have sought to put African countries. Hence, unlike what they did for Israel, unlike what they did for the Jews, unlike what they did for the Europeans after the Second World War, they did not pay reparations to Africa after a crime against humanity of colonialism. Now, what we're saying to the government of Zimbabwe is your option to pay this debt is to actually go to the International Court of Justice and sue the Western countries and the United States for compensation and reparations for the illegal sanctions that the United Nations called illegal, and that the Congress of the United States, after doing their own impact assessment, actually decided and wrote a report to Biden saying that these sanctions were illegal. These sanctions were actually stopping civilians from enjoying their human rights. They were stopping civilians from enjoying healthcare and other basic human rights. So they asked Biden to remove the sanctions. That's after our campaign. We believe that there's reparations that are due coming from the report of the UN and the report of Congress that admit that the crimes against humanity committed by these sanctions were illegal. They violated the human rights of civilians. And the International Court of Justice has actually got a handbook on the need for reparations for gross human rights violations. And we believe that these sanctions are gross human rights violations. If our government pursues reparations from there, they could get a significant amount of reparations from which they can get the money to repay the loans of the past and also to compensate these white farmers from those reparations.
Yes, but also, Rutendo, we know the ICJ, and we know that the ICJ usually goes against people of color rather than looking at this ugly colonial history of Europe and all these colonizers who have not only colonized Africa, but we've seen many parts around the world. And when we're talking about reparations, but here's a conundrum as well. Looking at Zimbabwe at this point in time, we know that the farmland belongs to the Zimbabwean government. Many of these farmers have actually left Zimbabwe a long time ago, well over 20 years ago. And just to understand the practicality of this payout, and then again, with the farmland belonging to the government, where does this leave the local population? Where does it leave indigenous Zimbabweans, and particularly those as far as land is concerned, and also at the same time, their role and their contribution in growing the agricultural economy of Zimbabwe?
Well, let me go back to something you just said now. You said that generally the International Court of Justice makes decisions against darker-skinned peoples. That's actually not correct. The International Court of Justice in 1987, 88, they actually made a decision in the favor of Nicaragua, saying that the United States government was actually perpetuating a crime against humanity against the Nicaraguan people by sponsoring rebels to actually fight there. Iran also went to the very same court in 2018 to actually sue the United States for illegal sanctions on Iran, even though Iran was already under UN sanctions for nuclear proliferation. And the International Court of Justice made a decision in the favor of Iran and ordered the United States to stop the illegal sanctions it was imposing because they were hurting civilians, and to allow medicines and other things that are required by civilians to go into Iran. So this shows, and the South African government is also in the International Court of Justice, and it's actually made a ruling in favor of South Africa on the issue of the Israelis needing to stop their aggressive actions in Palestine. A number of decisions have also been made against Israel, but it's the enforcement that has been lacking. However, when you get a reparations claim and reparations are awarded to you, you can actually take the properties of these countries that have been that you've been awarded reparations against. You take their embassies, you can take their properties, you can take whatever you can, wherever you can, and you can go to other countries to ask for the sequestration of their properties to pay those reparations. The problem is dark-skinned nations or non-white nations are not using these institutions to make the international custom that is friendly for dark-skinned peoples. And that's why people like Zimbabwe, South Africa, and other oppressed peoples must go to these institutions and use them to create the custom that is required. Because the majority of people who sit in these courts are actually people from former colonized countries. They're people from Arab countries, African countries, and third world countries. So we must use that. Now, you said, what happens now with the fact that these people that are going to get this compensation have not been living in Zimbabwe for a very long time? A lot of that money, if they are compensated, will not be used in the Zimbabwean economy. So what's the point? And that's the question we've been asking. And we've also been asking, why rush to compensate white farmers when the government of Zimbabwe has not fulfilled the majority of the other obligations that it has in its constitution, giving people healthcare, giving people accommodation or housing, giving people better standards of living and human rights. They haven't given those things, but they're rushing to compensate white farmers and saying they're complying with our constitution when they haven't complied with other areas of the constitution. However, they have started saying that they're going to give title deeds to people that have got farmland so that they can go and get loans from the banks. So that is a form of empowerment that is taking place where Zimbabweans who have got that land could be empowered to get loans from the banks for them to be able to farm that land much more effectively. But we would have thought that the 3.5 billion being given to the white farmers, given to locals, would have done a lot better to give us food security. Right now, you know, Zimbabwe has got a crisis. We've got GMOs being sold in the country illegally. We've got GMOs that contain cancer-causing chemicals like glyphosate because we're importing these things from South Africa. And this importation from South Africa is created because we can't farm our land with this climate change because we don't have enough resources to create irrigation in the country. I think we could have done better with this 3.5 billion, giving it to local farmers, creating irrigation facilities to give us food security. But the president has made his decision. And now the question is, how can we fund that? And like I said, the reparations aspect and the local farmers getting these loans is also not a fix, because these loans can also end up seeing Zimbabweans losing their land to lenders from even outside the country. Now, the government says it will put a clause to ensure that this land cannot be sold to anybody but locals or cannot be sequestrated by anybody but local lenders. But our government has illustrated an inability to enforce its laws. The reason we've got GMOs coming into the country, even though there's a ban of GMOs in the country, is because the government has failed to police. There is corruption within that government. There are many government officials that are taking bribes to break the laws and allow GMOs to come in. So the question is, how are they going to stop when international bankers lend money to our farmers, and then when they don't get paid, they come and take the land? I don't think they'll have the discipline, or I don't think they'll have the consistency to actually implement the law and ensure that the land will not be lost. So Zimbabwe is taking us back into the situation South Africa is fighting to take itself out of, where our land might eventually end up getting owned by the Chinese and the Europeans and the Americans as their banking institutions lend to our farmers fail to farm, fail to pay back their loans, and that land gets taken by financial institutions, and then the land then belongs to financial institutions, as we've seen in South Africa, where the colonial system and financial institutions control the majority of the land and white people.
Yes, and just finally, Rutendo, how is this likely to play out in favor of or to the benefit of those who are politically connected in Zimbabwe?
Look, that is the question that most people are asking, that who gets the land? Who gets the opportunity to get that land? So I think you are well aware that people like myself, my organization, was very instrumental in the removal of sanctions on Zimbabwe. And somebody would say people like me who've done the kind of work that I have done to remove sanctions on a country, to see billions of dollars begin to come back in the country, to save us billions of dollars that were being lost to the sanctions, and to also save human life because of the removal of sanctions, should have had land by now. But I've never gotten any land because the land is given to certain politically connected people, not necessarily to all Zimbabweans, and not necessarily fairly to people on non-partisan terms. So the people that are likely to be the biggest beneficiaries are connected people, are people that are aligned with the ruling party. And that is the sad part of the whole thing, because then it means they become the beneficiaries. They become the beneficiaries at the expense of other Zimbabweans. Yet land, if given adequately, if given correctly, can actually unlock a lot of dead capital that is lying within that land as capital begins to come in for people to be able to produce off that land. So the only thing we can do is to petition the government to be more fairer, to give land out to people who have the merit and deserve it, to give people who are patriotic and who can actually work and produce that land to be the ones that get this land so that they can then get loans to fund activities on that land. However, it's also important for poor people to get access to that land so that they can change their lives. Because we all know across the world that real estate, farming land, is one of the major means of reducing poverty, because once a person can produce their own food to feed their family, they're no longer hungry, they're taken out of poverty, and they can use it also to grow food commercially. And that is what we need to do to empower our people in the country. But having said that, there's also a problem we're seeing. Farmland is being invaded by illegal mining, by artisanal mining, mining is a good thing. It's a good thing for every Zimbabwean to be involved. But again, where it's not regulated and our government is not regulating, it's not enforcing the law, we're seeing degradation of farmland and degradation of land that could be used for farming purposes. And also, we're also seeing a lot of encroachment of sprawling urban areas and housing, because Zimbabwe is not building up, they continue to build sideways, they're encroaching on a lot of very good farming land, and we believe that those kind of policies need to be looked at if we're going to use the land effectively.
Well, Rutendo, we definitely will watch the space and we will follow developments, but for now, we thank you. We do appreciate you taking time out this morning with us right here on Salam Media. All the best to you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir.
Rutendo Matinyarare with us this morning against this Zimbabwean government making the commitment on compensating farmers to the tune of $3.5 billion. With that, we're going to go for a break and just remind you once again, the breaking news at this point in time is the newly elected leader of Hamas. Apparently, there are reports saying that he has been killed by Israel, but we will follow developments, and as we get a lot more information, we will keep you informed. That is the breaking news this morning. But right next up, we're going to have our Juma Nasiha, and this morning we will be joined by Maulana Anis Kara.